Hello and welcome to this edition of EB-5 Investment Report. I'm Amy Rios. Today we are joined by Jeff Campion, an immigration attorney who is also the principal of two regional centers, the Texas Urban Triangle Regional Center and the Gulf States Regional Center. Today we will be discussing Mr. Campion's dual roles along with some key issues facing regional centers like tenant occupancy, due diligence, and risk. Welcome to the show, Jeff.
Hi, thank you. Thanks for having me.
First off, why don't you give us a little bit about your background and how you became involved with EB-5?
Sure, I'd love to, and thanks for the opportunity to come today. I got involved in EB-5 about 5 years ago because working in Miami, we work a lot with Latin America. And as we all know, Latin America has instability consistently. That's just the name of the game in Latin America, just pick the country. And at this time it was Venezuela, and where I live is a place called Weston. We call it Westonzuela, and because there's so many Venezuelans. And so I had known, I've worked a lot with Venezuelans, and one of my clients called me and said that Chavez had sent the army into his office with guns to take over his business because his business was a casa de bolsa, so it was a brokerage house. Oh, wow. And what happened was the brokerage houses were all being shut down. And so he and three of his partners were going to have to leave the country immediately. So my client got on a plane, flew private over to Aruba, called me and said, I need to legalize myself. So we had to, at that time, understand what his goals were. And his goals were safe and stability in the U.S. And he had enough money, and he just said, Jeff, I want to get my residency as soon as possible. And so at that time, we were faced with trying to find a project that we thought would be safe from an immigration risk perspective. And there really weren't that many. And they were all equity for the most part. There was one company that was doing loans, but for the most part it was all equity. And so we had to pick what, in hindsight, you look now and you say kind of the best of the worst. But we picked it, it worked. He has his permanent residency, he's happy, got his green card, and that's kind of how I got into the EB-5 space. Had
you heard of EB-5 before this, or in your research you came across it?
Well, actually, I worked in EB-5 back in 1998, a long time ago. When I first came out of law school, I was working for a small boutique law firm that also worked with high net worth Latin Americans, and a client of ours invested in a project, and we got him out immediately because it became the project that shut down the program. And you had to put in $100,000. They had some sort of insurance with Lloyd's of London. It really wasn't at risk, and we were able to get the money back out. And that's how I first got into it, then got out of it, and then got back into it at that time.
So Jeff, you spoke a little bit about Latin America. Now, is that an emerging market that you're seeing come on board?
I think so. It has been a market for us, you know, from an attorney perspective, and I think it will grow because as instability continues in Latin America, just from a political instability and also just from a crime issue, I think that you'll continue to see, you'll begin to see even more people come to the States and use EB-5. You have Brazil, which we call them Brazilianaires, because it went through a great boom, and now it's really cooled down in Brazil. You've got Argentina that's now is having currency restrictions, very similar to what happened back in 2002 with the peso crisis in Argentina. And then, of course, Venezuela has instability very bad because of their Maduro, who replaced Chavez. And you know, their inflation now has gone through the roof. Their exchange rate used to be 6 to 1, and in the last 2 months, it's gone to 50 to 1. So it's pretty simplistic, but that's what's happening in those countries, and I think it will continue, at least from a Latin American perspective. I can't speak to the European side, but because where I'm located, it's heavily Latin American. So I do think that Latin America is a place to focus on.
Now, tell me about your regional centers. You have two. Why do you have two regional centers, and how does your role as an immigration attorney complement your role as a principal for these regional centers?
Right, so we have the Texas Urban Triangle Regional Center, which was the first center that we formed, and that was approved on October 14th, 2011. And I think we filed it 6 months earlier. And then the Gulf States Regional Center was approved in March of this year. And we actually have two others pending, one in the Northeast that will cover basically from Boston down to DC, Maryland area, and then one for the state of Florida. And the reason we formed those centers is what we wanted to do, what I wanted to do was to give a platform to developers to where they would know that they're going to get a certain standard of service and care if you come to the center. So if you come to Texas Triangle, if you come to the Gulf States, you come to the Northeast Regional Center, the Florida Sunshine State Regional Center, you're going to get the same people, the same, and so hopefully the quality is good, I hope. And hopefully we can give good service, and so they'll know that they can go and they can move with us. Because what we wanted to do is we don't want a project that is that just is going to EB-5 because it can't get funding. We want a project that is the gold standard. We want to work with the best developers that have projects throughout the whole country. That's the reason why. And you ask complementary. I think there are two actually things that can take place. One is complementary, and one can actually be dangerous. And so let me speak to the dangerous first, because the dangerous is, you're an attorney and you begin to see how much money you can make by filing the 526s, and so you tell the regionals, the projects, hey, you're going to use my regional center, you're going to pay me for it, but also why don't you let me do 20 526s because I can make a lot of money there. Yeah. And the reality is that's a conflict of interest. Yeah. Whether or not we want to admit it or not, it is. And so, matter of fact, the Florida Bar has spoken into that point specifically and said, if you own a regional center, you can't represent an investor. And so we don't. I don't. Okay. But I do think it could be problematic because maybe you wouldn't disclose everything that's going on to your client. And so that's one thing I think that attorneys have to be careful of. And so we don't do that. Now, I think, but the other side is since I do work in EB-5 on a consistent basis, that when I'm looking at a project as a regional center owner, my eyes are looking to make sure that this is going to work. Now, I'm not going to be the one that signs off from an immigration perspective. I'm going to bring in lead counsel to look at it. But at least you've got two guys that know what they're doing in the industry to say, at least we can speak the same language. A lot of times you speak with someone and someone's speaking English and someone else is speaking another language, although it's still English. Yeah. And so I think what we can bring to the table, what I hope to bring to the table, is to bring together good minds that look at a project and say, our number one goal is the investor above all else. And so that's what I try to do.
So how do you do your due diligence as a regional center and being an immigration attorney? Because due diligence seems to be such a huge topic in EB-5 and transparency and all of this. So can you speak on that?
Sure. So you have due diligence as it relates to a project and a developer. You have due diligence as it relates to the investor. And as it relates to the investor, what we're going to, as a regional center, we're going to rely upon the attorney to do the source of funds and make sure it's all done properly. Then obviously immigration is going to do their background checks to make sure this person isn't a criminal. But as it relates to the projects, I do think it's very important. And I think what you can do is some really basic things that my gut is that other centers haven't done, or the ones that have maybe had issues didn't do because they were looking at the dollar signs. And I think really simplistically, you can look and do a Google search, as simple as that sounds, on a developer to find out who are they. You can do a criminal background check on the principals of this project, of the developer, to find out, do they have any. Most developers are going to have lawsuits against them. That's just the way it is. But if you see a trend, then maybe you want to pause and get more information. I think that's the key, is that when you look and you see a trend, you want to pause and get information. I also think that a lot of times when you get a project, what you see now is developers maybe trying to inflate their budgets, because if jobs are created by the spending of money, and if I'm going to spend $100,000, just take that number, and I say I spend $150,000, I've created more jobs, which means I can get more EB-5 money, and that's what they're looking for, right? And so I think that you have to make sure, or try the best you can to understand, is this actually a viable budget, or is this accurate? Because the challenge is if the developer inflated the budget and the developer claimed it created more jobs, is that when you get the I-829 phase and he didn't spend the money, it created less jobs, and now you may have an investor who doesn't receive his permanent green card. And obviously you can't be an expert at everything. But I think for example, if you're working with a brand, say a hotel, And so a project that we have in Texas is a hotel with the Sheraton Hotel, and it's in Georgetown, Texas. And you've got the Sheraton and you've got Hines. So Hines is one of the best developers in the country, and you got Sheraton. So you've got two good brands working together. And of course, Sheraton's going to tell us, is this budget right? Are their forecasts right? And there are reports that are given, especially for hotels, on what is an average daily rate for a certain area. You can get those for $350. So what's an average daily rate? What's an average occupancy rate? And that's really important. Another thing that we try to do is that I try in my center, what we do is we say, if you want to be in our center, you need to use our business plan writer. Now the reason is, to be quite honest, is that the business plan writer works for me. In other words, she's not my employee, but she knows who she's working for. She's working for the center. And she was a commercial underwriter for 20 years. And so she'll call me on the phone and say, Jeff, these numbers don't make sense. And that's very valuable. Now, once again, she's not the end-all be-all, but at least if I can have someone that has some sort of background in this industry, that the finance industry, and say, Jeff, this makes no sense to me, or the numbers don't make sense, I think that's valuable from a regional center perspective, because at the end of the day, let's assume that you're a regional center operator and you want to make money, which this isn't a charity, I get that. The reality is, if your project goes bad, you're going to be out of business. And so, congratulations, you got one project done that then failed, and now you have no more business. And who knows, maybe they'll take your license away. So that's what we try to do.
Now, what types of projects do your regional centers do? You mentioned hotels, and do you have any I-526 approvals on those?
Yeah, so good question. That's always a good question. What do you have 526 approved? And so what we have right now is so the Texas Triangle was approved October 14, 2011. And what happens is, since we came into the business not as a developer, but as a third party looking to enter into the market and find good transactions, good deals, it took a long time. And so literally our projects are now just coming to market or are being funded. So we have a multifamily that is funded now, and the 526 are all pending. It was a $40 million raise. Okay. We have a hotel in downtown Dallas that's a $49 million raise that is funded and now being, the 526 are being filed. And then one that's in Georgetown is a hotel, and that's also, it's out in the marketplace. And so 526 approved, not yet, because as you know, unfortunately, it's 15 months.
So what about the timelines, and especially for regional centers, the timeliness of projects and the processing of the application seems to be taking a very long time. How do you deal with that?
That's a great question, because it's a challenge. It's a challenge for two reasons. It's a challenge for a developer and an investor, right? And so, like I spoke with a developer yesterday from California that's going to do something in New Orleans, or in upstate Louisiana, I'm sorry. And I said, you understand, this is 18 months before you touch the money. Like, if you start today, 18 months. And he said, that's not a problem, because I can bridge it. Oh. We're a very, very large company. We appear in the Wall Street Journal. We've got the cash to bridge it. So for him, a lot cheaper capital, worthwhile to put his money there to bridge it. But for other ones, other projects that may be large but they don't want to bridge, I tell them, can you find me a project that's 2 years out? If you can, or 15 months out, that would be ideal for now. Now we hope that the 526s will shorten their timeline, because as you know, it got switched from California over to DC, and a lot of the people that were working on 526s were actually put on the 924s. For regional center applications. Now, regional center applications are all going quickly, and so now they should be switched back to 526s. Assuming that happens, hopefully the timeline comes down to 6 to 9 months, 9 months maybe, and that's more reasonable, and you can actually explain that to a developer. Of course, with the investor, the challenge is, what do they want to put their kids in school? What if their kids are going to age out? I know we have the Child Status Protection Act, but what happens if we have visa retrogression? And so the CSPA protects your age upon filing, but when you get approved, if you can't file, there are some other issues with the CSPA that might make the child actually the CSP age over 21. And so those are challenges for the regional center issues right now that we're having. My gut is that as IAUSA continues to lobby, and as Congress continues to debate, and as even the president begins to understand more fully what this program is, those timelines will shrink.
What are some other big issues facing regional centers right now?
I think the big issues facing regional centers now, you have to make sure you know what the red flags are. And not every regional center operator is going to be someone who works in the field of law. That's not good or bad, just it is what it is. And so make sure that your attorney is explaining to you, hey, these are the red flags.
What are the red flags?
Right. That's a great question. That's what I was going to say, because here are the red flags, at least to me. When I sat down recently with about 4 months ago with the developer, I said, look, here's what you need to know. These are the red flags. Tenant occupancy, guest expenditures, let's not have any of those, and two-year construction timeline. If we can eliminate those from our correspondence with immigration, or if you have a good response to those and you feel comfortable, we're going to be fine. We're not going to do something that isn't in the fairway. And so I think as an operator of a regional center, you need to know that. You need to know, okay, tenant occupancy is an issue. If it is, and if we're going to have tenant jobs counted, how are we going to justify it? Do we have pent-up demand? Do we have a market study that shows that we're creating new jobs with new tenants? So what I tell my clients, and to be quite honest, what I tell my investors as an attorney, if we can invest in a project that only has indirect construction expenditure jobs, I'd much rather prefer that. If not, and we have to use tenant occupancy, then I want to know, is there a study? Is it backed up? And I'm not going to use guest expenditures. So those are, I think, the red flags you just have to look at and know. Because the reality is, it's not so much that those are bad issues. The issue is knowing them and having the right response to them. Immigration won't necessarily say you can't use tenant occupancy. They'll let you. They just want to make sure you have a valid basis for it. And the reason is, I don't know, for the people that are going to watch, the reason is the genesis of this is that 4 years ago, right, someone did job calculations based upon tenant jobs. They invested, the investor invested, at-risk money. The tenants never came. Well, so then immigration said, well, then the jobs weren't created. Well, then what happens to the investor? Immigration looks bad if they don't give them their permanent residency, right? And so what happens is, and this isn't always going to happen because it's fluid, is you don't know what you don't know. And so immigration isn't being mean or improper a lot of times. Sometimes they are. But in this case, they're just saying, we would never have known that would have been an issue until it became an issue. Now, and so when it's an issue, address it. And if you can't, then don't try to rely on it. Ultimately, from our perspective, we want to make sure the investor gets his permanent green card.
Can you describe business risk and immigration risk and what it means for investors? Yeah,
I'd love to. You know, I actually I wrote an article on it because I've gotten into a debate more than once with one of the largest brokers. And when I was in China, I got in a debate with him. When I came back, I got in a debate with some of his team here. And I've told them they're wrong. They're just dead wrong because they've conflated the two issues. To me, business risk is, well, will the hotel actually function? Will the developer actually build the building? Immigration risk is, will I get my green card? And what happens is, a lot of times, they get confused and they bleed into one another. And what I mean by that is this. Immigration risk in the context of EB-5, there's only two. Are the jobs created and is the money there? That's it. And so as long as they don't give back any of the $500,000, the money's at risk. Let's assume that. So now it's just job creation. Well, the immigration risk of job creation, since we're going to use, say, an economic methodology, is a lot of times, did the hotel perform as you projected? Because we were basing the jobs based upon operation jobs. Operations meaning the hotel restaurant, the hotel itself, maybe some rentals. And if you projected to do X and you actually do 20% less, then your jobs won't be as high as you projected in your original I-5 through 6 application. And that's an immigration risk. And you can't get away from that. Well, what happens is when a lot of brokers desire a first lien position, but a first lien position is a business issue. It's not an immigration issue. And while it might be the best position for business risk, and I'm not going to debate that today, The challenge is that when you take a first lien position on a property, that means you're first in the capital stack, which means you have a larger portion of the capital, say 60% of EB-5 money. But when you do that, that means that EB-5 is principally creating the jobs, which means you need more jobs, which means that they're not getting the benefit of the other money spent by the developer or the bank loan. The flip side is when you're in second position, you get a bank put in 60%, a developer put in 20%, and you in the EB-5 portion put in 20%. So now the jobs you need are just out of the 20% capital stack, and yet the whole 100% counts towards job creation. And so what you see is that actually, from an immigration perspective, there's going to be a lot more jobs to go around if 100% of the capital can be spent on 20% of the people, or 100% has to be spent on 60, clearly 20% is less than 60, your risk is less with the 20%. And so my point is that the immigration risk here can be minimized tremendously, and it can be minimized by simply using indirect construction expenditure jobs. And the reason I say that is, once again, we have construction jobs and we have operations. If we just look at construction, less than 2 years, so immigration doesn't fight with us about a 2-year timeline, all we have to do is show that the money was spent. Well, if the developer spent his money, the jobs were created. He could never open the hotel, could never lease out a building, could never have an apartment tenant, and the jobs are still created. Now, is there still a business risk? Sure, because what happens if the apartment's not functioning? I'm not getting any money back. Yeah. But that's a different issue. Okay. And what I've seen, every time I go to China, every time I sit with a client, I ask this question: if you had to choose, I-829 approved or money back, what do you want? Without fail, I want my I-829 approved. Yeah. Well, then why not focus just on that? Now here, in a perfect world, you get both, right? Yeah. Don't get me wrong. And that can happen maybe if like your EB-5 capital stack is 40%. So it's really small, and the developer's putting in, say, 40%, and then the city's putting in 20%, and so, okay, that's great. But that's kind of like Disney World. That's not the real life. The real life is a large bank loan or a large EB-5 capital part, smaller developer, and then smaller, mezz, depending on what you're doing.
Jeff, based on one of our recent workshops, there was a speaker who was concerned with once the immigrants got their green card and didn't get their capital back, that there were attorneys waiting on hand for that scenario to come into place. What are your thoughts on that?
It's a great point. And what I first say is I'm an attorney, so I can say this. You can get an attorney to file a suit about anything. And it's really sad to me that attorneys would be sitting there looking just to jump on something. I believe in protecting people, and so I don't have a problem with that. I do have a problem with attorneys that are just fishing. But let's go to the point, though, because the point is this: am I going to get my money back? Yeah. And I actually had an attorney come to me and say, hey, Jeff, I was approached by an investor who invested in a project. She has her green card now, and she's not going to get her money back. It was an equity-based project, not a loan-based product. And he said, what do you think? And I said, I suppose you could sue, but your reputation in the industry would be really bad. But, if she thinks she was wrong, fine. But I think the point that you're raising is really good. And here's the point. The SEC attorney's role in this, for not even the regional center, but for the project, the offeror, is to make sure that everything is, all the risks are spelled out. And
that there aren't misrepresentations.
Right. And they are going to see, look, bad people do bad things. And you can't avoid bad people doing bad things, obviously. But the SEC attorney has a huge responsibility to make sure that when he says in the risk section of the PPM, that he or she spells out all the risks that there could be. And that's why it's so important to have a good SEC attorney. Sometimes you'll get project developers that don't want to spend the money and they want to try to cut a corner there. The challenge is if you're the offeror, that's what's going to protect you when Janice doesn't get her money back, and it was just a natural business risk. I can't pay you back. Why? Because it's not operating as great as I thought it would, but you got your permanent residency. And here's what we need to understand. These individuals are intelligent. You don't just make $500,000 that you can invest somewhere by being dumb. And so I've consistently said to my team, you need to understand, today, coming from Venezuela, they're leaving crazily. They just want to get their green card. That's what they say. I don't care about anything.
Yeah.
Wait 5 years.
Yeah.
Like you're saying.
You'll be
wait,
like, where's my money?
Yeah, where's my money? Right. Show me the money, right?
Yeah.
And so I've said, what they say today won't measure up with 5 years from now. And so we need to make sure that when an offering is done, that the risks are disclosed properly, because I do agree with you. I think anybody, if they felt like they were wronged, that someone didn't tell them the truth, that they could have known something else, naturally would seek out legal counsel, and that's good. And I think that's right. Our system should do that. But I do think you're right that you're going to run into the individuals that that made maybe some promises they couldn't keep, and that didn't have an adequately drafted disclosure section of their PPM that will come back to haunt them.
Well, thank you so much for your time today, Jeff.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
As a regional center principal and an immigration attorney, Jeff Campion has a unique perspective on the EB-5 program that we hope you have found informative. I'm Amy Rios, and I'd like to thank you for watching this edition of EB-5 Investment Report.